I'm not sure why I'm telling this story. Maybe I just need to get it off my chest. Maybe it's because I still can't sleep at night without thinking about what happened at that lake house. It's been almost a year, but the details, they don't fade like you'd think they would. If anything, they've only gotten sharper. It was late last summer. My buddy Alex had just rented this lake house upstate near Lake George. Beautiful place, really. Remote, but not too far from town. It was me, Alex, his girlfriend Brooke, and her younger brother Jason. We'd all been wanting a weekend away from the city, somewhere we could unplug, relax, maybe fish a little, grill out, drink a few beers. Just chill. Alex, being the planner he is, found this place online, and it looked perfect. We didn't know then that perfect isn't always a good thing. We arrived Friday afternoon, and everything was pretty normal at first. The drive had been long, almost 6 hours because of the traffic, but the place was worth it. The lake was crystal clear, framed by these huge pine trees, and the house itself, it was exactly what you picture when you think lake house. Rustic wood siding, a wraparound porch, the works. There was even a dock that stretched out over the water. You could tell the house had been there a while, though. You could almost feel the history in the walls. But that first night, something was off. I don't know how to explain it. The air felt heavy, like there was something lurking, just waiting. I brushed it off as the usual first night jitters, new place, unfamiliar sounds. Alex and Brooke didn't seem to notice anything. They were all about having a good time, cracking open beers and talking about what a great weekend it was going to be. Jason was quiet. He wasn't like other 17-year-olds, at least not the ones I know. He was kind of a loner, always on his phone, usually with headphones on. But that night, even he seemed different. He barely touched his food at dinner, just kept glancing out toward the lake like he was watching for something. I asked him if he was okay, and he shrugged, muttering something about how the place gave him a weird vibe. I didn't press him, figured he was just being his usual moody self. After dinner, we decided to head out to the dock, sit by the water, and enjoy the quiet. Brooke stayed inside to clean up, and Jason came out with us but hung back a bit, standing at the edge of the dock, staring out over the lake. It was dark, darker than I expected. There weren't any streetlights, obviously, and the moon was barely a sliver in the sky. It felt like the lake just swallowed the light. I remember the water was so still, almost like glass, not even a ripple. "Peaceful, huh?" Alex said, taking a swig of his beer. "Yeah," I replied, but I wasn't feeling it. Something about the stillness didn't sit right with me. I kept glancing at Jason, standing there at the edge of the dock, his back to us. He hadn't moved in a while, just staring out at the water. I don't know why, but it made me nervous. After a while, Alex headed back inside to grab more drinks, and I figured I'd go check on Jason. As I got closer to him, I noticed he was tense, like his whole body was locked up. I called his name, but he didn't answer. I put a hand on his shoulder, and he flinched, finally turning to look at me. "You good, man?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He nodded, but I could see it in his eyes. Something was wrong. "It's just weird," he said, glancing back at the water. "Doesn't it feel like something's watching us?" I laughed, trying to brush it off. "What, like a fish? Come on, man, it's a lake." But he didn't laugh, he just stared at me, dead serious. "No, I mean it. It feels like, I don't know, like something's out there. In the water." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just kind of shrugged it off, told him it was probably just his imagination. But as we headed back inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that he might be right. Something about that lake had me on edge too. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear these faint sounds coming from outside, like a soft splash or a rustle of leaves. But when I looked out the window, nothing. The lake was still. The trees were motionless. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe a fish jumping in the water, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that. The next day, things got worse. Brooke woke up with a pounding headache and Alex was unusually quiet. Even Jason, who usually kept to himself, seemed even more withdrawn. We decided to go for a hike to shake off the weird vibes, but the whole time, I felt like we were being watched. I know it sounds crazy, but it was like the forest had eyes, like the trees were hiding something just beyond our sight. When we got back to the house, the air felt heavier than ever. The lake, which had been so calm the day before, now looked different. The water had this murky, almost greenish tint, and there were ripples, even though there wasn't a single breeze. Jason was the first to notice it, and he pointed it out, but no one wanted to talk about it. It was like we all knew something was wrong, but we didn't want to admit it. That evening, we decided to stay inside, figuring a movie would take our minds off things. But halfway through, the power went out, just like that. No warning, no storm, nothing. We sat there in the dark, the only light coming from the embers in the fireplace. Alex tried to call the power company, but his phone had no signal. None of our phones did. That's when Jason said it. "It's the lake." "What?" Brooke asked, her voice shaky. "The lake," Jason repeated, his eyes wide. "It doesn't want us here." I didn't know what to say. None of us did. We just sat there, staring at him, until finally, Alex broke the silence. "That's enough, Jason. You're scaring Brooke." But Jason didn't back down. "I'm serious. I heard something last night. Something in the water. It was calling me. That was it. I'd had enough." I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the door. "I'm going to check the generator. You guys stay here." I stepped out into the night, the cold air hitting me like a punch to the gut. The flashlight barely cut through the darkness, but I could just make out the path leading down to the dock. As I got closer, I heard it. A splash. Not a small one, like a fish jumping, but something bigger, something heavy. I froze, shining the light out over the water, but there was nothing. Just the same eerie stillness as before. I should have gone back to the house. I should have turned around and never looked back. But something pulled me forward. I walked down the dock, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The water was churning now, like something was moving just beneath the surface. And then, without warning, it stopped. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, waiting for something to happen. And then I saw it. A ripple, moving toward me, faster and faster. I don't remember what happened next. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I knew I was back in the house, Alex shaking me awake. I told him what I saw, but he didn't believe me. None of them did. But I know what I saw. And I know, deep down, that whatever's in that lake, it's still out there, waiting. You know, I never thought something like this could happen to me. But here I am, still trying to make sense of it all, and honestly, I don't think I ever will. Last summer, my buddy Chris invited me to a lake house in upstate New York. His family had rented it for the weekend, and he thought it'd be a good chance for us to unwind. I needed it too. The city was getting to me. Stress at work, relationship issues, you name it. So when Chris asked if I was in, I didn't hesitate. I figured a quiet weekend by the lake would be exactly what I needed. There were 4 of us going. Me, Chris, his girlfriend Rachel, and her brother Mike. We'd all known each other for years, and they were the kind of friends you don't have to try hard around. You can just be yourself, hang out, have a beer, and call it a good time. The drive up was long, but once we got off the highway, it felt like a different world. The roads narrowed, the trees got thicker, and the air smelled different, cleaner. I hadn't realized how much I missed the smell of pine trees until that moment. We got to the lake house late in the afternoon. It was isolated, more so than I'd expected. The house sat at the edge of this small, still lake. No other houses around, just woods on one side and the lake on the other. The place had this old charm, like it had been sitting there for decades untouched. It was 2 stories with a wraparound porch that overlooked the water. I remember thinking it looked like something out of a postcard. The first day was great. We unpacked, settled in, and spent most of the evening out on the porch, just talking and watching the sun set over the lake. I hadn't felt that relaxed in a long time. The water was so still, like glass, and the only sounds were the occasional splash of a fish jumping or a breeze rustling through the trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. That night, though, things started to feel different. I can't explain it, but when the sun went down, the whole vibe changed. The stillness of the lake, which had been so calming earlier, now felt eerie. There were no birds, no wind, no sound, just silence. It was like the whole place had gone to sleep, but not in a peaceful way, more like everything was holding its breath. I didn't say anything, though. I figured it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Chris and Rachel were inside making dinner, and Mike was out on the porch staring out at the water. I joined him, and for a while we didn't say much, just watched the lake. Then out of nowhere, Mike asked, "Do you ever get the feeling you're being watched?" I laughed it off at first, thinking he was just trying to freak me out. "What, like from the woods?" I asked, glancing over my shoulder at the dark tree line. "No," he said, his voice low. "From the water." I followed his gaze, but the lake was empty. The moonlight reflected off the surface, but there was nothing there. No boats, no movement. Just still, black water. I didn't know what to say, so I changed. But later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I woke up. It was pitch black in the room, and for a second I didn't know where I was. Then I heard it, a soft splash, like something moving in the water. At first, I thought it was just a fish, or maybe a branch falling into the lake. But then it happened again, and again, rhythmic, almost like footsteps. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound was faint, but it was definitely coming from the lake. My heart started to race, and I found myself holding my breath, just listening. After a few minutes, the splashing stopped, and everything went quiet again. Too quiet. The next morning, I asked if anyone else had heard it. Chris shrugged it off, saying it was probably just animals. But Mike? He didn't say a word. He just stared at his coffee, his face pale. That's when I knew something. The second day was strange. The weather had changed. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and the sky was overcast. We tried to make the best of it, though. Chris suggested we take the canoe out on the lake, and Rachel agreed. I wasn't too keen on the idea, but I didn't want to be the downer of the group, so I went along with it. We paddled out to the middle of the lake, and for a while, it was fine. Quiet, but not in a bad way. Chris and Rachel were laughing, splashing each other, and I started to relax. But then, out of nowhere, the canoe lurched to one side, like something had hit it from underneath. Chris swore, grabbing the sides to steady us, and we all froze. "What the hell was that?" Rachel asked, her voice shaky. We all looked around, but the water was calm again. No ripples, no sign of anything. Chris laughed it off, saying it was probably just a big fish, but I wasn't so sure. Mike didn't say anything. He just kept staring down at the water, like he was expecting something to come up from the depths. We paddled back to shore, and after that, the mood shifted. No one wanted to admit it, but we were all on edge. The house, which had felt so cozy the day before, now felt wrong, like it was too quiet, too still. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things, soft creaks from the porch, the occasional splash from the lake. At one point, I swear I heard footsteps outside my window. I wanted to get up, to look, but something kept me rooted to the bed, like some deep part of me knew I didn't want to see what was out there. The next morning, Mike was gone. We searched the house, the dock, the woods, but there was no sign of him. His things were still in his room, his shoes by the door, but he was just gone. We called the local authorities, but there wasn't much they could do. There were no signs of a struggle, no tracks leading away from the house. It was like he had just vanished. Chris and Rachel were distraught, and I didn't know what to think. Part of me wanted to believe he had just taken off, maybe gone for a walk to clear his head. But the other part of me, the part that had heard those footsteps, that had seen the way. We left the lake house that day, packed up our things, and drove back to the city in silence. None of us have been back since. But sometimes late at night, when the city is quiet and I'm lying in bed, I think about that lake, about the way it felt like something was watching us, waiting, and I can't help but wonder, what happened to Mike?